The Last Word with Ali Velshi starts right now. Hey, Ali.
There was so much great stuff in your show tonight, but I'm important to play that Dan Bongino clip, right, where he just says it out there. It's like, I used to have opinions that weren't based in fact, and now I'm the deputy director of the FBI, so I have to be based in fact, but one day I'll be back in that. It's like, what are you talking about?
I'm taking a brief hiatus from pushing conspiracy theories for profit.
That was weird.
Just a brief one.
Yeah, you know, when people tell you who they are, perhaps you should listen. That was kind of fascinating. Great show. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Ali. Have a great show.
Thank you. Pete Hegseth should resign. That's a direct quote from a statement issued by a coalition of House Democrats. They're joining a growing chorus on Capitol Hill calling for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to quit after two major incidents with his direct involvement have plunged the Pentagon into chaos. A new Defense Department Inspector General report confirmed what many suspected all along, that Pete Hegseth endangered the lives of U.S. service members by communicating about sensitive military intelligence in a Signal group chat, which led to calls for his resignation. Pete Hegseth is also facing calls to resign as chilling new details emerged about this deadly strike carried out on an alleged Venezuelan drug boat by the United States on September 2nd that experts say could be a war crime. The New York Times is reporting, quote, multiple people who've seen the video of the attack say the survivors climbed on the overturned hull of the boat and waved to something overhead, a gesture interpreted as an attempt to surrender, beckoning rescue, or trying to signal other alleged drug traffickers. Pete Hegseth's Defense Department has so far refused to show the American people the video of what happened during the attacks. Hegseth first said he watched the whole thing happen and that they knew who was on the boat. Then he changed his story, blaming, quote, the fog of war for the second strike, which killed two people on that September 2nd operation, which would be interesting, except for the fact that we're not at war, and alleged drug dealers are not war combatants. A group of bipartisan lawmakers, which included the top Democrats and Republicans from the House Intelligence and Armed Services Committees in both the House and the Senate, were shown video of the boat strike behind closed doors. Also in those briefings yesterday was Navy Admiral Frank M. Bradley, the Special Operations Commander who oversaw the operation under Pete Hegseth's command. After those briefings, those Democrats expressed shock at what they saw.
First of all, we need to be clear. There was no fog of war. They had a clear vision of these two people on top of what was left of their capsized boat for quite a while. Second, I saw Senator Cotton say that the two gentlemen were trying to turn their boat back up, I guess. That is patently ridiculous. That boat wasn't going anywhere.
There were two individuals clinging to flotsam. That's what there was. There wasn't weaponry of any kind. There wasn't a radio. There was no means for them to communicate other than the fact that the fire and the smoke was fairly well visible for a long distance around, but there was no radio. There's just no way to get away from the fact that the United States killed two individuals who were shipwrecked and in massive distress.
There was no doubt about the fact that I believe they were incapacitated.
We should have a public hearing. Secretary Hegseth should come before our committee and the American people, explain what he's doing, and justify it. Because this is I don't think it's justifiable.
Anybody who sees that video would have real questions about whether the United States is abiding by the values that distinguish us around the world.
I do wholeheartedly agree is we have a pattern from Pete Hegseth that is just not acceptable. This is an individual who is way beyond his capabilities. He should have been never confirmed. I've called for his firing or dismissal since the spring. Nothing has changed in my estimation of his lack of capability.
It's important to remember, this boat strike that we're talking about is just one of 22 boat strikes that have happened this year that Donald Trump's Defense Department has carried out under the command of Pete Hegseth. Hegseth has a deadly, serious job, and his actions have life and death consequences. And those 22 strikes have led to at least the deaths of 86 people. 86 people are dead because the Trump administration says those people were smuggling drugs on board these boats. We don't know if that's true because when you blow up a boat and blow up any evidence, who knows? To date, Donald Trump's Defense Department, under the command of Pete Hegseth, has not provided any evidence whatsoever to prove that any of these 86 people were smuggling drugs. Nothing. No paper trail, no photographic proof, nothing at all. They just release videos of exploding boats and say, take our word for it. Pete Hegseth is way beyond his capabilities. That's what the Senate Intelligence Vice Chairman Mark Warner says. He also says it's time for Pete Hegseth to resign. Leaders of the New Democrat Coalition, a center-left caucus made up of 115 House Democrats, put it this way, quote, time and again, the secretary has lied, dodged, deflected, and shockingly scapegoated his subordinates. He is a disgrace to the office he holds and should resign immediately before his actions cost American lives, end quote. Leading up our discussion tonight is the Democratic Congressman John Garamendi of California. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Always. Thank you.
I want to examine a few things here with you. The fog of war concept would be interesting if this were a war. It's not a war, and no matter how many times Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth say it, we're not at war with the drug dealers. We're not even sure what they're doing because we don't have names and we don't have evidence. Normally when you arrest a drug dealer, you see drugs and you get a rap sheet.
Well, it's not the fog of war. It is the fog of intelligence at the Department of Defense. Pete Hegseth is nowhere qualified to head up this department, the most important department in the federal government, obviously the biggest, the most expensive, and has the greatest consequences. He has to go. He never ever should have been nominated, let alone confirmed by the Senate. Unfortunately, one of the senators he is now in place. He must go. And he's not the only one. The entire department has been now with acolytes of Trump. And they're doing things that are very, very bad. Now, we've been dealing with drug boats for a long, long time. It's the Coast Guard's responsibility. Sometimes the Navy assists by stopping the boats. Coast Guard goes aboard those boats. If there's drugs, the drugs are seized. The people on the boat are arrested and questioned, and we have information. There's tons of drugs that are captured by the Coast Guard. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening here. This is flat out murder.
One of the things that people are calling for is hearings. Jay Johnson was just talking to Jen Psaki and calling for hearings. I worry that hearings don't mean the same thing anymore because we've seen Kristi Noem, we've seen Pam Bondi, we've seen Kash Patel at these hearings performing for an audience of one and not actually answering questions from senators or members of Congress.
Well, that's where where a hearing has gone wrong. If you depend upon a adversarial witness for the hearing, you're going to have trouble. And you just cited the examples. What you need to do in a hearing is do the investigations, have other lower level participants under oath talk about what their role was, and make sure that you know more than the actual key witnesses. And then you put the key witnesses into a box. You have all of that information. It's already been in the record. And you say, is this what happened? And then you can go after it. Let them dance, but they're going to be dancing in a very, very difficult situation. So we do need public hearings. We need to see, the public needs to see those tapes. The public needs to understand the intelligence. I know the intelligence community won't like it, but at least how the boats were identified as being narco-terrorists. So you do all the legwork. And you have witnesses. It may take 3 or 4 days to lay the foundation, and then you bring in Hegseth and the other heavy hitters.
Because then you've got a situation of who's lying. Because if somebody's given you some evidence under oath, then you confront the defense secretary with it. Say these people said X.
Exactly. It's not just a 1-hour dance by Hegseth or the principals. It's all of that background that you've got to get on the record, and then you can go forward from there. But there's a fundamental question here, Vilsack, and that is this a war, and for what purpose? And by the way, did Congress authorize the authorization to use force or war powers? We have not. And we're coming up, and here's my take on this. We're coming up in the end of January with a very, very important moment, and that is the extension of the budget. And we must use that as a lever, not only to deal with the healthcare issue, but also to deal with the president that is running away with the power of Congress to appropriate money. We have to rein him in. We simply have to say, sorry, Mr. President, you do not have any authority to wage war in Venezuela or whatever other place we want to go.
Right.
We have that power. It's going to be
Yeah.
messy. Will the Republicans stand with us? I would hope so.
Yeah, you may have legitimate beef about Venezuela and drug dealers, but this is not the way we do this stuff. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Democratic Congressman John Garamendi is a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Joining us now is Rachel Van Landingham. She's a retired United States Air Force lieutenant colonel and previously served as an active duty judge advocate. She's now a professor and associate dean of research at Southwestern Law School, Los Angeles. Thank you, Rachel, for being with us.
Thanks, Ari. Good to be here.
I want to quote to you from the New York Times, something that Congressman Garamendi was just saying. As a matter of plain reality, an unarmed speedboat, even if it is carrying cocaine, is not a warship. And none of the 11 people aboard, not merely the 2 initial survivors, but also the 9 people the U.S. military killed in its first strike, were fighting anyone. People in the military learn this, I would imagine, pretty early on. What rules of engagement are, what rules of war are, what international law is, and what U.S. law is about these situations. It's not really gray area.
This isn't a gray area. I mean, there are some areas. The only thing that's gray seems to be the fog of incompetence coming out of the Pentagon. But the fact that these are alleged drug smugglers that, as the congressman rightly pointed out, the Coast Guard has been successfully interdicting for years. They interdicted over 200 boats just this past year, and then successfully brought folks to justice through the Department of Justice. And so folks in the military know, which is why we had the leak, right? I mean, the leak came from somewhere that 2 shipwrecked individuals who should have been protected and should have been saved and shouldn't have been slaughtered were actually killed. And that leak came out from, I'm assuming, from folks in the military who know that this was wrong. And in fact, they know that this entire campaign is wrong, Ari. And that's something that I didn't hear the congressman say, and I would love to hear, is that let's get that Office of Legal Counsel memo, the Department of Justice's memo that supposedly has all the magic legal rationale on how suddenly, magically, what are law enforcement operations against alleged drug smugglers done according to the rule of law that we're instead now, shooting like fish in a barrel out in the ocean and asking our service members to do it, right? To put their honor at risk and tarnishing their duties to do the right thing and to follow the law.
Right, and until we have hearings or evidence, or we don't know what the story is, but the president and Hegseth were very fast to throw an admiral under the bus here, saying we weren't involved in this thing. But I think you make a larger point here. We have more than 10,000 troops now in the Caribbean. We've got a strike force group. We've got F-35s. I'm not sure 10 out of 10 people could tell you why we are doing this. You may really think that we should be taking a hard position on drugs and drug dealers, but I'm not sure we would think that this is the work of all of these members of the military.
Well, and there's no transparency here. We don't know why they're there. We know there's actually over 15,000 service members taken away from their families and poised outside Venezuela, despite the fact that there are hot spots around the world. And what about the shared war powers? I mean, where is Congress on this? Congress needs to be clearly and emphatically saying, hey, Mr. President, if you think we need to go to war against Venezuela, despite the fact that most international law said we don't just attack countries who are not posing an imminent threat to us, but if you think we do, then come talk to us. Let's talk about this. And that is a separate and distinct issue from just this campaign of what I believe, I agree with the congressman, a campaign of murder against alleged drug smugglers that our military is being told to execute.
But it's low-hanging fruit, right? It's easy. If you can get people to believe that they're drug smugglers, then it puts people in an awkward position having to defend them. But we're not defending drug smugglers. We're defending the rule of law. We're defending international law. And when you compromise that, you do actually compromise our service members all over the world.
100%. And drug smuggling is not a death penalty offense. If we want to make it a death penalty offense, let's detain them like we have been for years and plus up the law enforcement detention, interdiction and detention operations. And then if we want to make it a death penalty, which probably is going to be unconstitutional, we need to have that conversation. Instead, we're just killing individuals because this administration is acting like a judge, jury, and executioner. That is not the American way.
Talk to me about this, what it is you're supposed to do. There's an added complexity when you kill the 9 people. There were 11 people on board this particular boat on September 2nd. It wasn't apparently legal to kill any of them. But it's almost worse when you have survivors of a shipwreck, right? At that point, whether you believe they are drug dealers or criminals or whatever they are, you sort of have an obligation to rescue them and then sort out whatever it is that was going on. You don't just kill people because you might think they're bad.
And every service member is trained to apply the laws of war, regardless of whether or not we're in an armed conflict or not, as a baseline for preserving humanity. And this is about the humanity of those 2 shipwrecked individuals who are struggling to stay alive. We would expect that our service members we wouldn't want anyone to just strafe them out of the water,
right?
Just to bomb them out of the water if they were shipwrecked, right? So what about these folks? And it says a lot about who we are. Than that fact that we were willing to do this and willing to execute that order, and indeed willing to give that order. So I do think Admiral Bradley has much to speak about and much to account for. But he was put in a terrible situation by this administration and by Secretary Hegseth.
Rachel, thank you for joining us tonight. Rachel Van Landingham is a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and professor at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. Thank you. All right, coming up, how long have you been hearing that Republicans were about to debut their brand new health care plan? Weeks? Months? Years? More than a decade? With just days left on the calendar before Obamacare subsidies expire and costs skyrocket for millions of people, Speaker Mike Johnson says he'll have a plan ready by Monday, or maybe Tuesday. We'll discuss the GOP's never-ending, non-existent health care plan with the Democratic Representative Melanie Stansbury. That's next. Republican Speaker Mike Johnson's problems are mounting as millions of Americans are facing huge health care premium increases that will hit right after the holiday season. Yesterday, the Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer announced the Senate will vote next Thursday on the Democratic plan to simply extend the Affordable Care Act subsidies for 3 years until after the 2028 presidential election. Now, that would bring price relief to more than 22 million Americans who buy their insurance on the open market, many of whom are small business owners or independent contractors or farmers. So what's Mike Johnson's plan for the House? Well, so far his plan is the same as Donald Trump's plans. Let the ACA subsidies expire and let health insurance costs spike for millions of people in the new year. Now, some Republican House members are reading the polls 11 months out from the midterm elections and deciding that maybe it's a good time to run away from Mike Johnson. Here's what one member of Mike Johnson's very small majority said, quote, "It's just bad to go into a very tight midterm election and be hurting, 20-some million people in the country," end quote. Congressman Jeff Van Drew, Republican from New Jersey, said this: "To do this is buffoonery," adding to Republican inaction. Buffoonery. Some House Republicans are taking action themselves. A group of Republicans who are tired of waiting for Mike Johnson to unveil a Republican health care plan have joined with some House Democrats to introduce a bipartisan bill that would extend the tax credits for 1 year with some changes to the current system. Clearly, those Republicans have also read reports like this one from Forbes, which notes, quote, "Individuals or families purchasing insurance on the Affordable Care Act marketplace will face steep increases in premiums of up to 30% on average." But price hikes are not just hitting people with insurance through ACA or through the Obamacare exchanges. People with employer-sponsored health insurance, which is most Americans who are not on Medicare, are also facing sticker shock. Employees selecting plans in the employer-sponsored market, by far the largest insurance sector in America, will pay 9% more for their insurance in 2026, which is more than 3 times the current rate of inflation, according to KFF. Close to 165 million Americans receive health insurance through their employers. So, do the math on this. Nearly 200 million Americans will face a cost spike, and only one party is talking about making health insurance affordable. All right, joining us now is the Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico, a member of the House Oversight Committee. Congresswoman, thank you for being with us.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
Let's talk about this. This is not an abstract problem, but the solution to it for Republicans seems to be abstract. We remember a year ago, Donald Trump saying he had a concept of a plan, which is kind of fascinating given how long Republicans have been trying to repeal and replace Obamacare. In your opinion, is there a plan?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that these guys do not have even concepts of a plan. But I do want to say that this is worse than inaction. It was actively actions that led us to this point. If you recall, on July 4th, the president signed the big ugly bill, and it included $1.5 trillion in cuts to the healthcare system. It gutted Medicaid, it gutted Medicare, and it set into motion the current crisis that we're in because they were actively discussing whether or not to reauthorize the Affordable Care Act subsidies that are expiring right now at the end of this month. And they chose not to do so. And every single one of those Republicans that you just mentioned voted against it. They voted to gut healthcare. And so it's not just that they didn't take action, they explicitly chose to basically tank our healthcare system. So no, they have headed us into this crisis. This was at the heart of the shutdown. They had months during the shutdown negotiations to actually work on some sort of plan. And Mike Johnson instead chose to keep the House of Representatives out of session for 54 days and wouldn't even bring members back to Washington, D.C. to even have discussions. So this is completely a crisis that they have manufactured. And now they're in a panic and a tailspin because not only are millions of Americans going to lose health care, but because it has consequences for them for putting us in this crisis to begin with.
So in my next segment, I'm going to talk about affordability, which has really come back to bite Republicans because people do seem to vote in favor of affordability irrespective of their political ideology. And that's the same thing with healthcare. This is hitting people who are not necessarily Democrats or it might be Republicans. In fact, it's hitting Republican states disproportionately. At some point, you've got to imagine Mike Johnson and your Republican colleagues there are doing this math, as we've seen some are.
Well, I mean, listen, part of the whole heart of this crisis and the big ugly bill is that there was no logic to how these cuts to these programs got put into place to begin with. Like, if you think there's some sort of master plan to either fix or break the system, what they're doing is completely nonsensical because these cuts are going to affect every American, whether or not you're on private insurance, employer-supported insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, or the Affordable Care Act exchanges. When you take that much money out of the system and you take out the supports that make a viable marketplace and insurance pool possible, you cause healthcare to either collapse or for prices to skyrocket. And that's why in the data that you just showed, healthcare is going up for everybody. They created this crisis, and the president with his tariffs, the job market, the stock market bubble that may be burst in the coming months. I mean, this isn't just an affordability crisis. The United States is in a very precarious position with respect to the economy, the job market, and just the ability of everyday Americans to afford housing, healthcare, food. And this is a true crisis, and the Republicans seem to have no plan to get us out of it.
But you did talk about this concept about a master plan to break the system was written down in Project 2025, and Russell Vought was in charge of that, and now he's in charge of a lot of these things. And Elon Musk rolls in with Doge. You're ranking member on the Doge subcommittee, which is chaired by Marjorie Taylor Greene, which she's turned on the president. Where do we stand with this? Because it all kind of started there. There was a plan to wreck government and the services government provides to people.
Well, I think that as they worked on Project 2025, they had ideas that had been in the, atmosphere for decades about what a conservative plan for gutting government programs might look like. But then they brought in Elon Musk, who thought that he could run the government like a tech startup, and he conducted mass firings. He gutted programs in a haphazard way. They cut core programs and stole data and did things to the government that didn't break it in the way that they planned it. They broke it in a completely lawless and nonsensical manner. And so now we're left with the agencies and programs and even private sector programs like the health insurance industry, which are frankly in crisis because of how they've managed the situation. In terms of Doge, we don't know what's going to happen with Doge. We have reports that just a couple of weeks ago, the OPM director said it's dead, it doesn't exist. passed. And the White House tried to clean it up and say, well, it's a philosophy, it's embedded in the agencies. But even Elon Musk himself is turning his back on the Doge concept. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is like, forget about this. I'm out of here. The leadership of this House has no idea what they're doing. They're bankrupting the American people. The president is a liar. I mean, they can't even manage their own priorities to get anything done. And so there's very little confidence in any of this enterprise. And even the chairman of the Oversight Committee told me the other day, he doesn't know what they're going to do with the Doge Committee. I mean, this is a complete lack of leadership and direction. Yep. And frankly, it's the American people who are suffering.
Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Good to see you.
Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury. All right, coming up, candidate Trump promised to, I quote, make America affordable again. But now that Trump's in office, he doesn't want to hear about affordability. He keeps calling affordability, quote, a con job by the Democrats. The problem for him is that even his own voters are starting to realize that that's a lie. We'll talk about that next. Does anyone remember this guy?
The oath of office, I will rapidly drive prices down and we will make America affordable again. We're going to make it affordable again. Starting on day one, we will end inflation and make America affordable again. We will make America affordable again.
That was last year when Donald Trump was running for president. And by the way, that message may have really helped him in the election. We're now more than 10 months into his second term, and he seems to have shifted his messaging just a bit.
The word affordability is a con job by the Democrats. When they use the word affordability, they just say, they never say anything else. This election's about affordability, and then they go into the next subject. It's a con job. I think affordability is the greatest con job.
I think affordability is the greatest con job. A recent Yahoo YouGov poll shows that 79% of Americans say that compared to a few years ago, they are paying more money for the same goods and services. 60% say inflation is getting worse in the country, and almost half, 49%, say Donald Trump is doing more to raise prices than to lower them. That's actually the rub. Most economists agree that Donald Trump's tariffs are doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to raising prices in America. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, however, doesn't agree. The New York Times reports, quote, speaking at the Deal Book Summit, Mr. Bessent said American trading partners are opening their markets to the United States because of Mr. Trump's tariffs. He argued that the import taxes have not caused widespread inflation and said that they are an important tool for bringing back domestic production. Here's Bessent's incoherent defense of Donald Trump's incoherent tariff policy.
I believe that what we've seen, and I have to say that President Trump has been right on this, that he told me early on, he said, Scott, the United States is like a department store. Everyone wants to shop here. My evolution went to, well, I think we should do smaller incremental tariffs. And the president went in with a maximalist position, and that is actually what gave us the leverage in the negotiations by saying, okay, you've got a 35% tariff. When Japan agrees to a 15% tariff, it's domo arigato. It's thank you.
Domo arigato. Joining us now is Betsy Stevenson, the former chief economist at the United States Labor Department and former member of the Council of Economic Advisors, both under President Obama. She's now a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. Betsy, great to see you. Thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here.
Now, look, this is I'm bringing in a lot of an economic big deal here to answer a question that every American who doesn't know economics can answer. When Scott Bessent says, Donald Trump says America's like the department store. Everyone wants to shop here. That's not only the wrong analogy. I don't know if he's been in a department store anytime soon recently, whether he's been to Sears or JCPenney or wherever it is, but we don't really want to be like the department stores.
Yeah, that's a really odd analogy. So, I think what he's trying to say is actually everybody wants to be able to sell to the U.S. and we want to make sure that we can sell to everyone else. But this is like the confusing thing about the entire Trump economic policy is he campaigned on affordability And then he
Yes.
came into office and he pushed policies to push up prices to make sure that all those people selling to us would sell to us at a higher price. And he did that on purpose
Yes.
because he said if we're paying more for things, then it will be easier for us to afford to make things in the United States because everything will be so expensive. Why not make it in the high cost place? You know, the thing is, Americans didn't really sign up to pay a lot more on everything they buy in order to bring every single kind of production home. I don't think
Right.
any American was thinking we need to start growing bananas in the United States.
Or coffee or things like that. The irony, though, is that Donald Trump interestingly stayed on message during his campaign around this. And now he talks about affordability, and now he talks about how it's a hoax and a con job. The fact is, this is working for Democrats right now when they stick to this message. It was working for Donald Trump. I'm confused as to why he's given up on that, because I would argue that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, affordability is a real thing. It's not an abstraction.
Affordability is a message that any politician of any political party can run on and win on, particularly at a time when people are finding that things are less affordable than they used to feel. And if you look around, energy prices are up, healthcare prices are up, health insurance prices are up, childcare prices are up, rent is up. The world does not feel affordable when all those big ticket items, you're paying more for them. And, you know, I don't know why President Trump is running away from this. I think the
Right.
problem is he knows he's causing some of these increases in prices.
Right, and that's the interesting part about the tariffs thing. There was inflation in the last several years, and whether you agree with it or not, you could point to supply chain issues and COVID, sort of an external threat. This is now completely self-imposed. We don't have to do this way, and I think you would agree with me, and a lot of Michiganders would agree. Tariffs are not universally a bad thing, and they're not universally a good thing. They're a tool that should be part of a fairly diverse toolbox.
Yeah, broad-based tariffs, I think most people can agree, are terrible, right? We
Right.
start to look in specific tariffs and say, hey, this is an industry we really want in the United States. And so what we want to do is put a thumb on the scale to make sure that we're, you know, doing this particular job. We're making autos in the United States. Look, I'm in Michigan. If you live in Michigan, you believe we need to make autos in the United States. But that doesn't mean that we need a tariff on every single thing we bring into the country. And that is, you know, I don't think it gives him some big, you know, piece of leverage or some big kind of bargaining. What it's doing is pushing up prices for people. And if you are going to campaign and win on affordability, I'm going to tell you how to do it, because we can make America affordable. And any politician who wants to actually make it affordable knows how to do it. Increase supply. You bring more products to market, not fewer products. You build more houses. You make sure that there's more doctors out there, not fewer. They're cutting the amount of loans that doctors can get, which will reduce the number of doctors we have, which will raise the cost of healthcare. They are purposely taking policy after policy after policy that will reduce supply and therefore lead to higher prices. It's an anti-affordability agenda, and I think that's why President Trump's out there calling it a con job, because he's pursuing an anti-affordability agenda.
So one could argue that if you did this the right way, you could increase capacity for production factories for manufacturing stuff in the United States. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. But one of the reasons why someone would open a factory in the United States is because they understand what the policy is and that it'll be in place for a while. We're behaving a little bit like some of these economies that people don't invest in because they're not quite sure 1 week to the next, 1 month to the next, 1 year to the next, whether the policies that cause them to invest in a factory or to manufacture stuff will be in place.
That is absolutely right. Uncertainty is the enemy of economic growth, and the absolute enemy. And if you want to see the U.S. economy grow, they keep talking about trying to unleash growth. You know, the way to do it is tell people what's coming and be honest about it and then stick to it. And, you know, this is why people worry about things like who's going to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Is it going to be somebody who's just doing Trump's bidding? Why does that matter? Well, that matters because if you can't count on stable monetary policy, this might not be the country to invest in. And if you don't think this is a country to invest in, that is going to slow our economic growth.
Right. That's the thing that people will just never tell you, but they just won't. They'll make a factory somewhere else where they can actually depend on what the government's rules are going to be. Betsy, good to see you again. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Betsy Stevenson is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan. All right, coming up, spoiler alert, Trump's son-in-law and Trump's buddy in real estate development couldn't convince Vladimir Putin to end his illegal war in Ukraine. So now that Trump's best people have failed, what comes next? I'll ask Ambassador Michael McFaul after this. This week, Donald Trump's special envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, learned what every former U.S. ambassador to Russia already knows, that there's no peace deal to end Russian President Putin's invasion of Ukraine because Putin doesn't want one. The Independent reports that while in India yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared that Moscow intends to seize full control of Ukraine's Donbas region through military force. Mr. Putin stated, either we liberate these territories by force of arms or Ukrainian troops leave these territories, end quote. This is the war, remember, that Donald Trump said he'd end on day one in office. Day one. Kushner and Witkoff, neither of whom are diplomats, met with Putin in Moscow on Tuesday for at least 4 hours. What'd they get for their efforts? New threats from Vladimir Putin, saying he'll try to force an annexation of Donbas, which is exactly what Putin has always wanted to do. And handing over the Donbas region to Russia is already part of an alleged U.S.-backed draft peace plan that was verified by multiple media outlets. The plan had no input from Ukraine or from President Zelensky, and for officials in Kyiv, it's a non-starter. Meanwhile, morale among U.S. diplomats has cratered under Donald Trump. According to the American Foreign Service Association, 98% of active duty Foreign Service members worldwide reported poor morale. 86% says changes since January have affected their ability to advance U.S. diplomatic priorities. Nearly a third reported changing their career plans since then. Joining us now is Michael McFaul, MS Now International Affairs Analyst and former U.S. Ambassador to Russia. He's the author of the recent book, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. Ambassador, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
These meetings between Vladimir Putin and Witkoff and now Jared Kushner, Putin can do this all the time. He can sit in meetings for hours. You've seen the fact that this guy can give press conferences for many, many hours at a time. This costs him nothing to just sit around and chew the fat with Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Nothing comes of it, though.
Correct. At least to the best of our knowledge in the public domain, I've seen absolutely nothing that has come from multiple visits with Vladimir Putin and Mr. Witkoff. There has not been a single concession. Again, maybe there's something secret we don't know about, right? But in the public domain, not 1 inch. He hasn't moved on one position and has not changed his original goals of this invasion since 2022. And instead, what you have is you have this dynamic where Mr. Witkoff goes, Mr. Kushner goes. By the way, that photo you're showing there, 3 of the 5 people in the meeting are business people. Only Putin and Ushakov. I've sat at that table. I've been at that table negotiating with those guys before. Only 2 of them work on national security. The other 3 are business people. That's very, very odd way to get a war ended. But what happens is they just listen to what he says and they come back to Washington, they brief the president, and then they try to get the Ukrainians to go along with what Putin asked them of. That's not mediating an end to the war. That's just giving, carrying out the orders that Vladimir Putin wants. And I hope finally, after a year of this strategy, they pivot to a different strategy because this one's not working.
But Putin's hope is that if he just sticks to his guns, everybody else will sort of cave. Everybody else will say, all right, what we're trying is not working, so why don't we try something different? There is an argument that resolve around the ongoing support of Ukraine does ebb and flow, and it's at an ebb at the moment.
Well, yes and no. It's definitely not in the White House. There's a lot of people that just want to walk away. That's clear. That's not what public opinion shows here in America. It's very striking to me that support for Ukraine continues to be maintained, Democrats and Republicans. It's not just a polarized partisan issue. Second, if they wanted to actually end the war to the point you talked about earlier with Putin, He wants Donbass. He's been very clear about that from the very beginning. You're not going to persuade him to change his mind to give that up. So instead of trying to change his mind, the Trump administration needs to change his capabilities. If he can't march forward in Donbass, that will create the permissive conditions for a genuine negotiation. And the way you get to that is more and better weapons to Ukraine and more and better sanctions towards Russia. Now, that's what you need to get a real peace deal. I'm not saying that's what will happen, but if they're serious about it, they have to put some pressure on Russia. So far, it's all been carrots for the Russians, sticks for the Ukrainians, and that is not achieving an end to this horrible, barbaric invasion of Ukraine.
So you're a student of history. Regardless of the goal to end the war, one has to go back to the 1930s and realize the danger in allowing an invader to take land and keep it. In fact, under the Russian proposal, they want to claim land and keep land that they don't even control right now.
I'm glad you underscored that, because I have studied a lot of wars and I've studied war termination, and I can't think of a time when an army said, give us territory that we haven't even conquered before we settle. That is just how absurd and maximalist Putin's proposal is. And there's reporting that the Trump administration is considering to ask the Ukrainians to do that. But your point about the 30s is a really important one, because, I've been giving a lot of talks about my book around the country, and I hear from time to time, Professor McFaul, why do we care about Ukraine? That's far away. We got our problems here at home. And I get that sentiment. But if you study the 30s, that's exactly what happened here in our country in the run up to World War II. The Japanese went into China and people said, that's not our problem. Then Hitler and Stalin went into Poland and people said, millions of Americans, by the way, not just a minority, said, that's not our problem. And we know how that ended. It ended with us getting dragged into World War II and millions of people dying. And I really fear a similar scenario in Europe today, and especially our allies do. They worry that if Ukraine is allowed to fall, they are next. And if that happens, then we will be dragged into a war that we don't want to fight. So better to help the Ukrainians stop the Russian army in eastern Ukraine so that we don't get dragged in with our NATO allies fighting the Russian army in Estonia or Lithuania. It's really just that simple to me.
Ambassador, you always underscore the history, and until somebody explains to me why that history is not relevant anymore, that's what we continue to have to point to. Good to see you as always. Michael McFaul is an MS Now international affairs analyst and a former United States ambassador to Russia. We'll be right back. I hope you'll join me back here tomorrow for my show Velshi at 10 a.m. Eastern for our latest meeting of the Velshi Band Book Club. And tomorrow, we're dusting off our copies of Jane Austen's beloved blueprint for the modern romantic comedy, Pride and Prejudice. We'll look at it alongside a truly modern work, Moderation, by the acclaimed Filipino-American writer Elaine Castillo. The New York Times called her book, quote, Pride and Prejudice for the Age of Platform Capitalism. Elaine Castillo will be my guest tomorrow. That's 10 a.m. Eastern right here on MS Now. And that's tonight's last word.